This is the webinar on ramping up student information. In this webinar, we're going to be looking at how you can kind of enhance the biographical information that you maintain in the system. We're going to be looking at how you use family groups in MMS. We're going to look at what your options are for mass editing biographical information. We'll look at the biographical compare and update feature, and also look at how you register a new student after the school year has started and how you get their information up and running for the year. So the first thing we're going to look at is the family group or family ID feature that MMS has. I'm going to go into the student biographical records. And on the first screen that you open up to in the biographical records, you'll notice that down here towards the bottom, there's a family ID field. In your MMS database, you might notice that this has information in it or not, or some students have a family ID entered and some do not. The family ID is a tool that you can choose to use that allows you to tell the system which students are part of the same family. The implications of doing this that we'll look at in detail during this webinar include this would give you a quick way to update contact information for students who are part of the same family group, and you will also have the option when you're printing labels and certain reports in MMS to indicate that you just want one copy per family. The Family ID field is, again, an optional feature for you, and we leave the system kind of as a blank slate for you if you choose to use it. So if you choose to associate students in the same family together, the first thing you would need to do is create family IDs for students who have siblings in your school or district. So I'm going to close out of the biographical records, and we'll take a look at where these family codes are created. Under the biographical menu and more biographical editing jobs, you'll notice there's a function to edit family codes. I have family codes already in the system, and you can see that this simply contains a family ID or code and then a family name. To add a family code, you'd simply click on the yellow plus and enter the code you want to use. Now this is totally up to you. The code can be letters, numbers, or a combination of both. I have seen schools whose family codes are simply a series of numbers. I personally like to start the family code with the first few letters of one of the family's last names so that it's a little easier to find in my list of codes when I'm assigning it to a student. So I'm going to create a code for a family and start with the first three letters of their last name, and then simply 001 to indicate this is the first code I'm entering for a family whose last name starts with BAL, and I'll click OK. This adds the code to the list, and then I can type in the family name. Now the family name could be something as simple as the name of the family. If you have a blended family, this might be a good place to indicate what the different last names of students in the family might be. And you can save that. One thing to be aware of if you're part of a school district that's using MMS is that the family codes span the schools in the district. So if you have the elementary school create a family code for an incoming kindergartner, the other schools in the district, middle school, high school, other elementary schools, will be able to access that same code. So if this kindergartner has a sibling who's a 7th grader in the middle school would be able to take this same family code and assign it to the 7th grader. Because the codes span the schools in your district, it's important to have some coordination among the schools so that people aren't duplicating efforts, or, you know, the elementary school uses one family code for the elementary students and the high school's using a completely different one. If your goal is to be able to generate maybe a district-wide letter and have one printed per family, you would want to make sure that all the schools are using the same family code for students in each of those different schools. So just be aware that this listing of codes is unique in that it spans all the different schools in your database. And again, an elementary school that adds a new family code, that code is then visible to the users in the other schools in the district. And it helps to have some coordination then if you're part of a district. Now that I've created a family ID, I'm going to go back into the student biographical records and find the students I'm going to assign this code to. Okay, so I have Bridget and Christopher here, who are part of the same family. I'm going to go into Bridget's record and assign her family ID. Now again, the list that I see here is the list that I was just editing, and if you start your family codes with the first few letters of the last name, you'll see that it's a little easier to locate the code in the list. So here's my BAL001 code, and I'll assign that to Bridget, and then move on to Christopher and assign the same code. A few things you might notice once a family ID is assigned. If I look at Christopher, he has a yes for primary sibling, and Bridget now has a no. You control which child in the family group is designated in MMS as the primary sibling. That's controlled under the Admin menu, Database Configuration, and School. At the very bottom of the School tab, you'll notice it asks which child will be considered the primary sibling, the oldest child in a family group or the youngest child. And that's what controls whether a student has a yes or no for primary sibling. The system will look at the designation you set here and then look at the student's birth dates as they're entered in MMS and decide which student in a family group should be the primary sibling. The primary sibling you could then run reports on to see, okay, who are my primary siblings? If you have a policy where you send home a newsletter every week, a paper copy of a newsletter every week, but you just want to send home one per family, so you want to know who the primary siblings are in each class or homeroom so that you know how many newsletters to send down to that room. And you can change this designation at any time. So if you start off the year with the oldest child being the primary sibling and you realize that it would be better to have the youngest as the primary sibling, you can change that here. This setting is specific to the school. So while the family codes themselves kind of span all the schools in your district, when you make the setting as to the primary sibling, the system is just concerned with siblings within this one school. Let me go back to my newly assigned family codes here. One thing to be aware of with the family IDs is that if you have students in your school who do not have any siblings in the school, leaving their family ID blank tells the system that this student is kind of a family unto themselves. You know, they don't have any siblings. This is one family group right here. So for schools and districts that are considering beginning to use the family ID feature, sometimes the thought of having to create and assign all those family IDs can be a bit daunting. If it's helpful, think of it in terms of the fact that you only need to create and assign family IDs for students who have siblings in the school. students who don't have siblings in the school, you can leave their family ID blank and still be able to use the features such as generating a report with one copy per family, and the system will know that this student is their own family unit, basically. So let's look at the advantages to assigning family codes. I'm going to come into Bridget's record and go to her contact information. And I'm going to add a work phone number for her mom here. When you have family IDs assigned and you change any piece of contact information, when you save that data, you can set up the system so that you get a prompt to have MMS make that same change to any other students with the same family ID. So when I click on the Save button, I get a message that I've made changes to the contact record, that this is the family ID the student is assigned, and it asks me, would you like to apply the same change to all students that have the same family ID for all schools? So again, if you're part of a district, this change would go across the schools and affect any students in your database who have this family ID. If I say yes to this, when I go to Christopher's record, you'll see that the phone number now represents the change that I made in Bridget's record. And conversely, if I add another phone number here, save that, I'll get the same prompt. I'll say yes. And if I go into Bridget's record, I'll see that new phone number also added. So one of the benefits of using the family codes is it makes updating your contact information easier. You only have to think about updating one student's contact info. The system can do the work of updating any siblings or other students with the same family ID and updating their contact information. The setting that lets you choose if you want to get that prompt about updating contact information for other students with the same family ID is taken care of under the Admin menu and Database Configuration and the Biographical tab. You'll see that there's an option here that says you can turn off the feature to update contact records for students with the same family code. When this is unchecked, we get the prompt, and you still have control over whether you want the system to update the other records or not. But if you don't want to get that prompt, you can check off this option, and then when you make contact changes, if I take out this phone number for Bridget and save that, you'll notice that I don't get the prompt to update other students with the same family code. And if I went to Christopher's record, I can see he still has that phone number that I entered earlier. So again, if you want to make use of the feature that will update that contact information for you rather than you having to go into each sibling's record and make the change, you can leave that database configuration option unchecked so you do get the prompt to update the records for other students with the same code. Now, once you do assign family IDs, there's a biographical report that lets you see which family codes you've created and who's assigned to them. So under the biographical menu, more biographical reports, we have the family code listing. You can run this with just a listing of the codes and the descriptions. in which case you'll see this. Or you can run it choosing to see the family members who are associated with each code. So here's the family ID that I added. I see the 2 students associated with it, and I see which one is the primary sibling. You can also include on this list students who do not have a family code, and those would be basically the only children in the family group in your school. And then we get to the ones who do have family codes assigned. I had mentioned that if you assign family codes, you could also run a report to see who the primary siblings in each family are, if that's helpful for distributing materials. So to get that report, I'm going to come to the biographical menu and the print biographical list by field report. Here, you could select the data item that contains the information as to whether a student is a primary sibling. I'm going to come down to the field called Pri-Sib Flag and print that. Here I'm seeing the students who are not primary siblings. When I get to the page where there's a yes, I'll see the students who are primary siblings. Another way you could run this that might be more useful is running the report by something like homeroom and then choosing as one of your optional fields the primary sibling flag so that you get a homeroom list and then you can see who the primary siblings are. So if I run this, for Homeroom 101, I'd be able to see the yeses for the students who are primary siblings, so I know which students in this class are designated as the primary siblings. Another advantage to using the family groups is that in some of your reporting options, you'll have the option to print 1 per family. So I'm going to come first to the biographical menu and more biographical reports and mailing labels. On the mailing labels, there's an option towards the bottom to limit the labels to 1 per family. Let me go into my student range and select the students that I assign the family code to. I'm going to select both, Bridget and Christopher, and let's run the labels in style B, and I'll print that. Now this is set with a no to limiting the labels to 1 per family. If I set this to yes and print, I'll just get 1 label for both siblings. So you have the option to print 1 per family when you're running the mailing labels. You also have the option to print 1 per family when you are running the mail merge. So if I come to biographical operations and biographical mail merge, there's an option in the center to limit the letters to 1 per family. So if I said yes to that and then built my table, let me go into my student range and select those 2 students again, just in the interest of time. If I click Build Table and then generate a letter, perhaps my letter might be something as simple as when open houses or things like that. Let me create a very quick letter here. When I go to print the letters, because I had selected on the first screen to limit them to one per family, I'm just going to get one letter that I could just send home with the primary sibling, as opposed to having 2 copies of the same letter for both siblings. So just keep in mind that with mailing labels and with mail merge letters, you'll have the option to limit to 1 per family. In the fee tracking area, if you use that portion of the system, on many of the reports you have the option to limit or group the information by family group. We saw in the mailing labels you have the option to print 1 per family. And again, another big advantage to using the family codes is when you're updating contact information, you can use the feature to have the system do the work of updating the information for other students with the same family code. So next we'll move on to mass editing biographical information. This can be a great tool to save you time in updating biographical data. It's located under the Biographical menu, Operations, and Mass Edit Biographical Information. Anytime you have a group of students that are going to have the same information in a particular biographical data item, the Mass Edit feature is a quick way to get that data entered, as opposed to you having to enter it individually for those students. So in the Mass Edit, we're going to look first at how you edit a value into a selected field. Typically, the mass edit is used in this way to update information such as grade level for the new school year. Here in the box I have an alphabetical listing of all the different data items in the biographical part of the system. As I said, mass edit is often used for grade level. It's used for homeroom when you're getting the new year up and running and you're assigning students to their homeroom and homeroom teacher. You also can use the mass edit area for state information. So if you're required to submit reports to the state through MMS, you have access to the state data items here. And for instance, if we use this Pennsylvania field as an example, field PA112MIGR, if you want to mass edit that the majority of your students are not migrants, you could do that here. So keep the mass edit in mind for state fields because it can save you time in entering that information. So let's do an example with grade level. With mass editing, what you would do is pick the item you want to enter information into and double click on it here. And the first thing you want to do is enter the data you want to change to. So if I'm updating grade levels, what I would do here is enter the grade level I want to change students to. So let's say I want to, in the new school year, update grade levels and promote my 11th graders to 12th graders. If I'm doing that, I would select 12th grade here because this is what I want to change to, and I'll click OK. And you'll notice that in the lower left-hand corner, it tells me that it's going to set the grade level to 12. And then I need to indicate which students are going to be changed to 12th grade. Now, there are 2 ways that you can do this. You can go into the student range and kind of handpick which students should get this change. Okay. So in this case, I might put my students in order by year of grad. And select all my 2013 students and make sure that they're 12th graders. If you're mass editing homerooms and you simply are going off homeroom lists, you could come into the student range, check off the 25 students in that homeroom, click OK, and process. So you can always use the student range to choose the students who should get this information. The other thing you can do is use the set condition feature. This lets the system do the work for you. So in set condition, you tell the system what criteria to look for the students who need to be changed to grade 12. So that might be something like you'd come to the field name and select year of grad maybe. Year of grad is equal to 2013, and then click apply and close, and you can see at the bottom you've told the system change the grade level to 12 where the year of grad equals 2013. And when you process, MMS does the work of locating these students and updating their grade level. You'll get the message asking, are you sure this is what you want to do? And then it tells you how many students it changed the grade level for. And then you could double click on grade level again. Say this time you want to update the grade level to 11th grade. We're using the set condition, so I could go into set condition and tell it to look for my 2014 students and so forth. So the mass edit simply puts data into the field based on the information that you provide here. There's also an option to move data from one field to another. So if you, for instance, had information in a user-defined field that you had created, and now there's a field in MMS, maybe for state reporting, that we've added to the system that's going to contain the same information, you can move the information from one field to another here. So maybe you were recording information in a user-defined field. I'm just going to come down to user-defined 1. I would double-click on that. You'll notice it gives us a message that that field has been selected. And then over on the right, where I indicate the field I want to move data to, I'd indicate which field now I want that information moved to. So in my example, maybe I'm going to take information from a user-defined field and move it to a Pennsylvania field. So I'd double-click on the field here and click Apply. And I'll notice in the lower left-hand corner, the system says it's going to move the info from the first field to the second. And when you process, it will do that. It will take the data in the first field you indicated, move it to the second field, and in the process of doing that, it will remove it from the original field. So it's important to realize that when you move data from one field to another, it's going to now no longer be in the original field. That information will just be in the new field that you indicated. The copy data from one field to another leaves the information in the original field and also puts it in the new field. So you don't clear out the data in the process of copying it. So here, again, maybe you're going to take the information in a user-defined field and double-click on it and move it to a new field and double-click on it. I should say copy. And again, when the system copies, it's going to leave the information in the original field, also place it in the new field, and so you'll have it in two places basically. Now, one more thing about the mass edit that we often see that schools use is sometimes, for instance, when you're getting the new year up and running, you have that data in the new school year, but you want to clear out information like what the student homerooms were last year and the homeroom teachers and so forth. So you can use the mass edit feature to blank out information. I'm setting this back to edit value into selected field, and I'm going to select homeroom just because that's typically a field that you might want to clear out when you first get the new year up and running. And if you want to blank something out, you simply double click on the item here, and instead of choosing a value from the drop-down list, you simply leave this box with the blue filling, and click OK. And you'll notice that down at the bottom here, it says it's going to reset the homeroom to blank. And then you can select if you want this for everybody in the school. You just leave all the students selected in the student range. Otherwise you can use the student range or the set condition to indicate who should have their homeroom blanked out. But again, when you're getting the new year up and running, often you're not ready to assign homerooms yet, and it can be a little confusing if the homeroom or the homeroom teacher is still listed there from last year. So you can certainly blank that information out if it keeps things clear as you're going through updating for the new year. This is a good opportunity to point out to you our help documentation because when you're in a screen in MMS and you click on the red question mark, it will bring up the help related to that part of the system. And with the mass edit especially, if it's a feature you haven't used before, it can be kind of reassuring to see the documentation about how to make your selections here so that your mass edit is effective. You can also go to the help menu. Let me close out of here for a second. You can go to the help menu and the table of contents. And I'm going to go to Biographical, and this was under Operations, and it's the Mass Edit Biographical Information. Okay, what's nice here is it explains that you have 3 different options. You can edit values, move data, and copy data. And to find out more information about any of the 3 functions, you just click on the More link, and it will explain to you how you go about doing this process. So in the edit area, it'll talk about how you select the information you want to include, and then how you select the students using the student range or using the set condition feature, and it walks you through some examples. And then it does the same for moving data and copying data. So the help documentation, as I said, can be really useful, especially if you're not familiar with a function yet, in providing you with some background information about it, as well as step-by-step instructions for how to use that feature. There's another function in the biographical area that allows you to move information between school years. So to move biographical information between school years. I'm going to use an example that we typically come across where schools get their new year up and running sometime end of winter, beginning of spring, so maybe February. They copy all their records forward to the new school year, but then they have a few months where they're maintaining information in the current year, in this case 12-13, and they're updating things like parent email addresses and phone numbers and addresses and state information for the students. Well, during that time that you have both school years up and running, the 12-13 and the 13-14, the last thing you want to do is maintain that information in 2 school years. So we typically recommend that when you have changes to student biographical information, you update that in the current school year, and then use this function called Biographical Compare and Update that will allow you to transfer that information forward to the new year. So under the Biographical menu and Operations, there's a Compare and Update for new school year. This actually serves 2 purposes. You'll notice that one of your choices when you come in here is you can add new students from the current year to the targeted year. So imagine a scenario where you moved the information forward to the 13-14 year in February, and of course you've had new students enter your school since then. So towards the end of your school year, you want to copy the information for those students forward to the 13-14 year so that they're scheduled in the new year and so forth. You would select the option to add new students from the current year to the target year, and you can see it explains here that only new student records will get added to the target year. No change will be made to records that already exist in that target school year. So I'll check off Add New Students from the current year to the target year, and in the center here, I'll select my 13-14 school year. Okay, so my goal here is to take new students I've entered since the 13-14 year got up and running and copy them from 12-13 to 13-14. I definitely want to go into my student range at this point and select just the returning students. Okay, so I don't want to select, for instance, my seniors who are graduating this year, because if I leave them in the student range, the system will realize that they're not in the 13-14 year and it will transfer them over to 13-14, and I don't want that. Typically you go into the student range and you select just the students who are returning next year, which can be all your underclassmen, you know, your juniors, sophomores, and freshmen, and then process, and the system will look at that group of students you chose, and if they're not already in 13-14, it will copy their biographical information forward. So that's one of the functions of the biographical compare and update. The other one is the function that will update specific data items. So I'm going to check off that I want for selected data fields to apply and edit from the current year to the target year. And it's important to realize what it explains here, that this overwrites the selected fields in that target year with the values from the current year. So imagine this scenario. When I move my information to 13-14 back in February, a student's phone number is, 555-5555. I receive information that their phone number has changed, so I update that phone number in the 12-13 school year. I don't want to have to think about updating it in 13-14. So this function, if I check off the option for selected data fields, I check off the 13-14 year, here at the bottom of the screen, I have an alphabetical listing of all the biographical data items, and I can make sure I select an item like contact phone numbers. And what the system will do when I process this is it will take the updated phone number I have in 12-13 and transfer it to 13-14 and overwrite the old phone number. So this is a great tool to take all those changes you've been maintaining in 12-13 and update them in 13-14. So when you use this feature, in the list of data items that you have at the bottom of the screen, you want to select just the ones that should overwrite previous information in 13-14. So for instance, typically schools will choose things like all of the contact information. Now the contact information can be identified. It generally starts with a C for contact, and then in the center, in parentheses, it has CON as coming from the contact table. So you'd select contact information, and I'm just control clicking on these different items to select them. Now as I scroll down the other items, there are some I'm purposely not going to select. So for instance, the grade level. I don't want to select that and have their 12-13 grade level be moved forward to 13-14, because chances are I've already updated grade levels in the new school year. I don't want to bring the kiddos back to their grade level in 12-13. Also things like homeroom and homeroom teacher. Again, because those are probably updated in 13-14, I don't want to select those items. So often what schools do is, in addition to selecting the contact fields, they will select state-specific fields. So if you think about the fact that you'll most likely be updating the state information all throughout the end of the school year, you can use this function to take that updated state information and copy it forward to 12-13. So schools would typically select state fields here as well. Now, because when you're using this to transfer forward data-specific items, it's helpful to save your setting so that you don't have to painstakingly select the fields here each time you come in to run this. So you can save your settings. And I got a great suggestion from a school during a training once where they had run this function before and they found that they had a tendency to forget to go into the student range and deselect the students who were graduating. So what they did was, in their setting name, they put student range all in capital letters so that every time they came in here and recalled the setting, they had that reminder that they needed to go into the student range and deselect the students who would be graduating this year. And again, we want to do that so that their information doesn't mistakenly get copied forward to the new school year. So you can save a setting for the data items that you want to update in the new year. Again, we have it checked off to update selected data items in the 13-14 year. We can go into our student range and deselect the students who are graduating and process. And again, the advantage to this is it allows you to just maintain your information in one school year, and you can run this compare and update as often as you want to get that updated information into the new school year. The next feature we're going to look at, or the next process we're going to look at, I should say, is how you register a new student in MMS after the new school year has gotten up and running, or, you know, over the summer as new students come in to register for school. So when a student registers in your school, you're going to be adding their information to the biographical area to start with. We need a biographical record before we can do anything else. So ultimately, we want the biographical record to be in place. When a new student comes in and registers, it's a good idea to get in the habit of, before you enter a brand new record for this student in biographical, to first check and see if the student has a record in your database in another school or in another year. So I'm going to do one example of each. I'm going to do an example of a student who's in the database in a prior year, and then I'm going to do an example of adding a new student who's not anywhere in your database. So when a new student enters, you can make use of a function under the biographical menu. So I'm going to come to Biographical, Operations, and find a student. What you would do here is type in the student's name. You could just have their last name if you don't need to have first name, middle name, birth date, and birth city. That just helps to limit who you're looking for. But even with just the last name, you could type that in and click Find. And I'm looking for Corey, so I can see him listed here. And he's going to have a record for each year and each school that he appears in the database. So you can see that he was here in 11-12. And if I want to copy his information forward to 12-13, all I need to do is highlight his name and click Copy Record. Just is going to confirm that I'm going to copy the 11-12 biographical data to 12-13, and I'll say yes. And now if I go into the biographical record, I'll see that Corey is here. Now granted, his information is from last year, so you might need to go in and update his contact information and so forth. But the big advantage to using this method is the student's ID number will be the same as it was earlier when they were in your database. And the ID number is so essential, especially if you're a high school and a student has one ID number with you their freshman year and a different ID number their junior and senior year. When you try to calculate credits and GPAs, the system isn't going to make the connection that this student was here their freshman year also. So the ID number is essential, and if a student has been in your database before, the easiest way to ensure that their ID number is consistent from year to year is to use that Find a Student feature and copy their record forward to your current year. Once they're then in the system, as I said, you can make changes or updates to their biographical records. If you use the Find a Student feature and you do not find a record of the student previously in your database, then you would come to the student biographical records and add the new student in. So I'm going to click on the yellow plus sign, and the first thing you're prompted to do in this case is enter an ID number for the student. Now oftentimes schools and districts have a convention that they use for the ID numbers. You know, perhaps the student's year of grad is incorporated into the ID number and so forth. So you would want to check and see what kind of system is in place already for ID numbers at your school. This screen is giving us three options basically. It's saying you can enter a complete ID number here. So if you know exactly what the next ID number you have that's available, you could enter that here. Click OK, and the student will be entered with that ID number. You could also simply have the system give you the next available ID number that isn't being used. Now it's going to be very sequential if you choose this option, but if you say suggest next number, it's going to tell you the next sequential number that is not currently in use. Or you could use a combination of the two. You know, maybe my ID number starts with the student's year of grad, and then I have a random three-digit number after that. You could enter the first part of the student's ID number, which is pretty standard for anyone in their year of grad, and then click Suggest Next Number, and the system will tell you what the next available number is. And then you click OK. So once you've done this, you of course need to enter the information for the student. And the tab key will move you from field to field here. I learned my lesson. One time I entered myself as a student when I was doing a training. So I have my MMS, displayed on a screen for all to see. And I put my actual birth date in there, and you'll notice that as soon as I hit the Save button, the student's age gets displayed up here in the right-hand corner. Well, when I had my actual year of birth, all I can say is it was very sobering to see my actual age up there, magnified for the screen itself. So I've never done that since that depressing moment. So you would enter your data for the particular student, including contact information and so forth. On the Attendance EWR Status tab, you can give them an entry date. Now the reason this is included in the biographical area as well as the attendance area is precisely for scenarios where you have new students that you're adding to the database, because kind of one-stop shopping. You're entering their biographical data, their contact information, and you can give them an entry date as well. So on the Attendance EWR Status tab, you need to click on the yellow plus up in the toolbar. That will activate a row for you, and typically the date that's entered is the first school day in your calendar. You can click on the drop-down list or on the calendar button and select the student's actual entry date and entry code. Over to the right, there's a calendar ID column. You can make sure if you have more than one calendar in your school that the student is assigned the correct calendar. Typically then, you need to assign the student a schedule. So again, there's a few different ways you can do that. You can go into the schedule editor. And here, for each class you want to add, you can click on the yellow plus, indicate that you want to add a new course and that you want to assign sections. And you can either highlight the course you need to put the student in and select from the sections that are available down here. So I can put the student in English 9, third period. You also, when you click on the yellow plus, over here on the right, if you have gaps in a student's schedule that you need to fill, you could select a period. And when you click on View Period, you're going to see all the classes that are offered that period. And you could check off one that's appropriate for this student. You can further refine that list by selecting a term. Do you need to fill in this period for the whole year or just a semester? And you could even limit it further by department if you're using departments. And then you'll see what's available. So you'd highlight or just click on the row of the class you want to add to the student's schedule. It'll select the course and section, and then you can click OK. So one option for adding schedules or coming up with a schedule for a student would be to kind of hand build it here, adding each course and finding an appropriate meeting time for each course. The other thing you can do is come to the Schedule menu and More Schedule Editing Jobs and choose Enter Initial Course Requests. This can be used at the high school level if you know what courses the student needs to take, but you want the system to do the work of finding the sections that they're going to go into. So here, since the student already has an English class and I believe a history class, let me choose a math class. So I'm just going to check off Algebra 1 and a language and a science class. Okay, so what I'm doing here is simply selecting the courses that they need to take based on their grade level and so forth. And I'll click on the blue diskette to save that. And then you'll notice that there's a button here towards the lower right that allows me to run the partial scheduler. What the partial scheduler does is it looks at the courses you've said this student needs to take. And you'll notice the student is not assigned to any sections yet. So it looks at the courses the student needs to take, and it's going to look at your schedule itself and figure out where it can schedule this student. So it'll see that the student needs to take course 223. It'll see what sections are available. If there are 3 sections available, the system's going to consider the other courses the student needs to take and work on scheduling the student into these classes. The advantage of doing this is, number one, the system does the work of finding the best possible schedule for the student, and you can rest assured that when you run the partial scheduler here, the students who are already scheduled into their classes are not impacted by this at all. All of those students stay in the classes they were scheduled into. The system is merely seeing if it's got room to schedule this student into any of those courses you indicated. So when I run the partial scheduler here, I have choices here in terms of, am I going to allow overloads for the sections or not? I'm going to uncheck that and process. If I exit from there, I'll see that the student was scheduled into 2 more classes. They didn't get scheduled into the French class. I'll have to see if that's because the class is already full or if there's another reason there. But if I click on print here, this will give me a listing of the courses this student is taking. I can also go back to the schedule records and print out a schedule for this student. To see what their schedule is going to look like. You might end up using a combination of methods. You might go to the initial course requests first, enter in what the student needs to take, run the partial scheduler, and then if there's something the student didn't get into, come here into their individual schedule records and see if they can't get into French, is there a different language they want to take or a different elective they could take and so forth. At the elementary level, I'm just going to switch to my elementary school here. When you have a new student come in like this, if you're using the skills grading portion of the system, you can come to Skills, More Skill Grade Editing Jobs, and enter Student Class Assignments. You're going to notice this looks very similar to where we just were with the high school student, but here my only option is to put the student directly into a section. I'm not just giving them general course requests, I'm specifically putting them into a section with a teacher. And at the elementary level, another thing that's nice is that you could click on the teacher column heading and put the classes in order by teacher. So if I know that this student is going to be in Mrs. Blank's classes, I then have that teacher and all of her classes grouped together, and I can check off the ones that this student is going into and then click on Save to basically schedule that student. Okay. Also, at the elementary level, you could come to the grading menu and more grade editing jobs and enter initial course sections. This is more of the screen we saw at the high school level where you could select the courses themselves or the sections, the individual sections themselves. At the high school level, that function to enter the initial course requests also has the option to put a student directly into a section if you already know what section you want them to go into. But typically, if your schedule is a little more complex, you first assign them simply the course request here and then run the partial scheduler to have the system see if it can schedule the students into those classes. If your nurses are using the health portion of MMS and new students are entered by you into the database, often the nurses will then need to update health information. If it's a brand new student to your school or district, the nurses can go to the health menu and enter student immunizations. So they could find the new student here. and then enter the immunization dates for the student. If the student has health conditions, they can come to either the health menu, more health editing jobs, and edit students' health history, or they could come to the H button here in the health toolbar and simply click on the yellow plus to add various conditions that the student might have. So immunizations and health history, typically the nurses would add as soon as they have a chance, and then as the nurses conduct screenings and so forth, they could add that information as well. If the student has been a part of your school or district previously and they have health information from previous years, the nurses wouldn't be able to run this function because it's typically reserved for your MMS users who have more access. But under the admin menu and school year maintenance, in the example of Corey Cable, who I moved over from the 11-12 year, I could come to school year maintenance and basically copy his health records for immunizations and health history and screenings that would have been done at the school in those prior years, and I can copy them from the 11-12 year to the 12-13 year just for Corey. So I would select the from school and year, the to school and year, and then from my list of tables, I could come to the health student health history table, control click on the health student immunization table, the health student screening table, and then in my student range, I could select just Corey. Again, nurses rarely have access to this feature. So, someone with more access to MMS would need to run this for them. But this is the quickest way to get the information the nurses might have entered in prior years or different schools in your district and update that in the current year and school that the student is in. So those are just some of the ways that you can kind of enhance the data that you're maintaining on the students, or enhance that data so it makes your life easier through things like the family codes, the mass editing features that you have access to, the biographical compare and update, and the different tools that you can use as you're registering new students into your school.